100% Billings, 100% wrong. You could be perversely starving the business of the resources that it needs to grow because short-termism will be the focus. The practice never moves out of the here and now. You end up with these really reactionary practices. And so the price you pay for this is substantial. You are capping your personal revenue at 100%. That's it. You can't earn more than that. And so you're basically saying that you're never ever going to earn more from a business than as if you worked and you didn't have to pay for all the support structures. So I think if you're listening to this, the thing to do is just to think, okay, I didn't know there was another way of doing this. And then you just have to walk away and think, what are the different actions I need to take? Welcome back to the Scale My Clinic podcast. Todd Cameron here, and today I have my good friend and business partner, Sachin Patel. Welcome, Sachin.
Cheers, Todd.
100% Billings, 100% wrong. Sachin, we hear this all the time from owners, and it's a bit of a legacy thing. Doctors bragging about what percentage of their billings they get to retain and how they think as a business owner, the objective is to get to 100%. I'm really keen to get your perspective on what are they thinking, what's the mindset involved here, and how can it lead you down the garden path?
Yeah, so I suppose it all starts with, do you want a well-paying job that you are fully dependent on as an owner, or are you starting your practice or owning a practice because you're trying to create something of value, as well as leveraging impact? Like, you know, most often when we speak to owners, of course, people want to have a financial reward for their work, but often that's not the primary motivation. It's often, I'm trying to build a practice in my vision, one that has a good culture, one that does great work in the community. And so whether it's for financial reward that you've started, or it's for impact, or a combination of that, which is the reality for most. And often the financial reward is the last thing on people's mind when they're thinking of practice ownership. So what we find that happens when I have these conversations is if all of the incentive and the thought process is tied to how much I bill and what retention I keep of my billings, then it can really negatively impact that ownership journey in a few different ways and at different phases of the ownership journey. Like, you know, the startup or pre-ownership phase, it can affect the thinking. It can affect the middle of the ownership journey, like, you know, the messy middle. And it can affect the exit. And so it can actually be quite harmful all of the way along, that way of thinking. And it's something that I reckon it would probably cost someone that mode of thinking at least $1 million in their business ownership cycle.
So unpack that for me, Sachin. $1 million, that's, I mean, I know you don't get out of bed for less than $1 million. And so what exactly is the $1 million about? Why are they paying that price in terms of the opportunity that they're paying by not thinking about it the right way?
Oh, yeah, perfect. So I'll give you a classic example. I was speaking to some owners the other day. They've been in ownership 2-3 years, 5 doctor practice. I met with a couple of them, and the conversation started with, you know, oh, we're doing pretty well. And I was like, oh, great. How are you doing? You know, tell me more. And what they proceeded to tell me is, I was speaking to a couple of them. We're doing really well because the going market rate where we are is a 30-70 split. But all of us as owners, we're on a 75-25 split. And I said, okay, interesting. Like, how's the practice performing? And in this case, I think, you know, it was maybe just shy of 6 figures as a practice, as a profit. Todd, you and I, you know, we've worked with enough practices to know what latent potential is there. And so we went through our process that you and I go through on a practice growth call to just really identify what the opportunity was there. And as I did that, you know, I could sense and calculated somewhere in the region of $300,000 to $400,000 of latent opportunity in that setting.
Right.
And so the way it plays out is that because as all of these individuals as owners as individuals, they're thinking 75-25, then their income generation sort of activities are all about how much more can I generate in billings, personal service income. And what they're not thinking about is what can the business generate. And so their focus and activity is all incentivized to be with seeing patients. And it is never focused on growing the business as an actual service entity which supports and serves other doctors as well.
Which is where the value is, right? The business value is in the business.
Yeah. So then let's play that out. So you've got this, practice entity in this case that's maybe earning 10, 20,000 shy of 100,000. Okay. And so on a typical multiple, because, there's not much fat in the system there. That's a thin margin. But, on a typical multiple of 3-4 times, let's say 3.5 in this setting, because it's, pretty basic setup. It relies on the owners. So we'll be generous and say 3.5. So in this setting, here you go. You've got, if they're making 80, then you're probably talking 80 times 3.5. So what's that? About 280 as a value, something like that. And so you've got a business value there of around 280-ish. Now, say they do the work that many others that have gone before them have done and thought about things a bit differently, then they would have a more commercial arrangement with their practice entity. So maybe then they would be at a 65-35 split or a 70-30 split or somewhere,
Engaging just as everybody else does in the practice. Yep.
Then the service entity is already earning better, but then they've gone and done the work and actually utilized all of the opportunities and capitalized on all of the opportunities of owning an actual business. And then they push their profit up to where we know it could be, which say, let's pick 400 in this setting, right? They're adding about 320, which is eminently there. There's capacity, there's opportunity. So then in that setting, they've also gone about building systems, processes, a team that does not depend on them doing the income generation. Now, when you do that, then suddenly you've got, say, a 400,000 profit, but then the multiple, because it doesn't depend on the owners doing the work, and there's better systems, you're then talking 5.5, or 6 times in multiples. So even if you went on a 5 multiple, right, then you're going from 280, say 300, up to 2 million. There's already 1.7 million of value there. However, it doesn't stop there because there's a few other things that may not have been considered. So first of all, there's thoughts and consideration to personal services income. So when they're on a 75-25 split, that is all personal services income. There's no getting away from that. It's very simple.
No opportunity to income split or take advantage of any other adults in the household.
Exactly. No opportunity to invest as wisely as you might be able to with other vehicles. So that's number one. Number two is that wealth generation, which once you've built and once you've started to develop assets in the business, we should be using some of the wealth generated in the business to generate wealth outside the business. You start looking at a 400,000 earning. There is then borrowing capacity to purchase buildings, other practices, which is what these owners wanted to do. But with their current mode of thinking, it would be very hard for them to be able to think in a way that would allow them to expand in a way that would support what they say they wanted. So what they were doing and what they thought and what they wanted, all three of those were on different planes of thought. And you really actually, until those ways of thinking, the vision and the actions are aligned, it's going to be very difficult to create what one thinks one wants. That makes sense.
And if anything, you could be perversely starving the business of the resources that it needs to grow, because short-termism will be the focus. You'll be, I want this number to be higher, and so therefore I'm going to spend as little as I need to in order for that number to be higher for me. And that can be the problem with that kind of a strategy.
Absolutely. So then what happens? The next iteration of that. So that's one way of thinking. The next iteration, which is just a slight pivot on that way of thinking, is in a practice that's maybe running on, even if it's set up in the way that you and I are talking about, where each owner who's a GP may be contracted with, or may contract the practice just like any independent GP. But now what happens is they're motivated, they want to grow the practice, they want to put some work into the business to make it better. Then they're sitting in a meeting and they're saying, okay, I'll take over marketing, I'll take over recruitment, like whatever activity or function it is. And then the thought is, oh, how can we reward that person to do that work? And then bright spark idea, hey, you're doing that extra work and we should reward you for that. So we're going to reward you with a lower service fee. And therefore, suddenly the incentive, unintended, best of intentions, is that that person is rewarded for doing patient contact.
Not the thing. Yeah.
And that's exactly the problem that you see that happens. And it's happened, that second one has happened with the best of intentions. But again, the action and the intention don't line up. And so you can end up in this holding pattern, because what you often will find is things don't get done, or resentment builds because it takes time, but it still feels like I'm not getting paid for this thing that I'm doing. Because ideally, the reward, if you're going to remunerate someone for doing an activity, it should be tied specifically to that activity, not tied to some other activity that doesn't support the outcome that you're trying to achieve.
The wrong proxy metric is just going to cause a moral hazard. You're causing people to get benefit in one way, but it's not actually the way that they're doing the work. And that's something we need to be careful of in anything in business.
100%.
Absolutely. So, Sachin, you mentioned that this focus may be tax ineffective as well as harmful to the business. It does sound a lot like the old partnership structures that have been out there. Talk a little bit about that and the legacy issues that kind of thinking has caused, often in really large clinics.
Yeah, so some of the things I've seen, and I know you'll have more to add here, the types of things I've seen are every owner has to put in a set amount of service fee. So if they're working like 2 days a week clinically or 4 days a week clinically, everybody has to put in 100,000 or whatever arbitrary number has been selected, which again, has never made sense to me. I'm very simple, Todd, you know that. I'm not that bright. And so the way I've done it, and I think about it, is yes, it might make sense at the beginning when, you're both working hard, or if there's more than two of you working hard clinically. But the ultimate aim is actually for you not to be working clinically, but in those old days, or to be working, much less clinically as you lead a practice. That might not be the same for everyone, of course. People have different wishes, but from, again, most of the conversations you and I have is people want to ascend and start to lead and mentor others in that journey. But what you see is that, yes, at the beginning, your sleeves up, you're at the pump, you're doing whatever clinical work that needs to be done. And so it may make sense that, there's three of us, let's all put in exactly 100,000. And because we're all working lots, we should just keep the rest for ourselves. It's just another version of the reduced service fee. But then what happens is, say maybe there's a mix of genders in ownership.
You'd hope so.
Yeah, you would definitely hope so. But then what happens is it disadvantages maybe those that need to take off time to have a child, or maybe in relationships where there's one partner who has to do home duties. It disadvantages anyone in that position because they're then forced to be contributing a minimum amount to the business as a service fee. And so what I've seen happen is people focus on their partners, the business partners, as, oh, you're not contributing enough, you need to contribute more. They're forgetting about creating other income generation for the business. And they also, in that sort of resentment that builds, forget to actually mentor and grow the other people in the practice? They're the things I've seen, but I'd love to hear your experience.
Yeah. Well, like you said, they just avoid unpaid activities. And when I say unpaid, I mean immediately paid, like the transactional work that is part of general practice. And so the biggest problem with that is that the focus of work is on the things that are urgent and important, if we're using the Eisenhower matrix, and they miss all the things that are important and not urgent. They basically get ignored. People development, recruitment, training, education, upskilling, top grading, processes, systems, as you said, marketing plans, all of the things that are an important part of a sophisticated business get zero attention because it's not generating money right now. And so what that means is all of the things that are part of income generation over time just get ignored. So the practice never moves out of the here and now. You end up with these really reactionary practices. And typically the practice managers in these just have to manage the personalities that, I'm just going to be really honest here, they're really selfish because the structure promotes people thinking selfishly. And because they're rewarded for doing that, then there's no loop that breaks it. And what usually breaks it in the end is a partner who becomes ill, can't work anymore, or just kind of cause bad luck on it, says, I'm not doing this anymore. And then the whole structure falls down because everybody else has to pick up their share of the contribution. And by the time that happens, it's a little bit like when a gambler is discovered in a household, the debts that have been run up, the accumulated neglect of all of those structural things I mentioned earlier, is that the clinic's about to implode and they need to change something really quickly. But they don't have the capacity or the skills to do that because they've spent usually a couple of decades all working for themselves. And so it's a very, very similar problem to that. The other issue, I think, Sachin, is it promotes you just continuing to work in the practice. And so ultimately, the three things we talk about, people working towards profit, well, they're really ignoring profit because they see it as personal revenue. The other one is time freedom. You can never get time freedom from that structure because in order for you to be able to brag about the high percentage, you've got to do the work. And you usually have to maintain it and have very limited holidays. And the dream team, again, they're the three kind of pedals that you and I focus on with owners. You can't have that either because there's never enough funds in the business to expand, grow, develop, and train the team because you just have the minimum viable team pretty well all the time. And they just tend to be task rabbits, they tend to be directed, do this, do this, do this. There's not really much in the way of leadership or coaching independent thinking in those environments. And so the price you pay for this is substantial. And then on an individual basis, the other thing, this is kind of obvious but important, is that you are capping your personal revenue at 100%. That's it. You can't earn more than that. And so you're basically saying that you're never, ever going to earn more from a business than as if you worked and you didn't have to pay for all the support structures. It's a really foolish way of thinking. And actually, why would you cap your potential earnings? You might want to set up multiple environments. You're going to attract other people who think like that too, right? And that's actually another thing that I think is a big issue because if all you think is getting a higher retention for you and paying a lower service fee, if you think that's the best clinic, then it's not really the type of clinic that most of us want to work in. And one of the great ironies of general practice, I think, is, I have just come away from a practice owners conference, spoke to a lot of owners. The ones who are having the most trouble with recruiting, this is almost universally true, are giving away the highest GP retention. So these people are doing 75, 80%, amounts of money that actually don't make sense for an owner to give away, but they've defaulted to the only way I can get somebody is to give this. They almost never get people taking those positions. And if they do, they leave after a month or two. They don't stick around. Why do you reckon that is?
Because it's crap.
Exactly.
Because what happens in these places is that it's like silos. And so if you walk into them, they're typically just everyone lives in their room. There's minimum interaction. There's no laughter, joy, celebration, like color. It feels like an old black and white movie, and tumbleweed down the corridor. And that's the reality. And it's not enjoyable to be in that sort of environment where everyone's just doing their own thing, because there's just no incentive and no culture of coming together. And we know that, GPs, we're a collegiate bunch generally, and we do like to be together discussing things, collaborating, coordinating, helping each other, being helped by others, sharing our tough moments and cases. But all of that stuff people look for, and want to feel genuinely supported. And it doesn't matter what the number is or the percentage is. It's only so long that the vast majority of GPs will put up with an environment that isn't conducive to those other things. And I suppose in that environment, Todd, there's some other knock-on effects, because often the people who've worked in this way have worked so damn hard. They have worked hard for years, like 10, 20, 30, 35, maybe 40 years. And then think, because they've worked so damn hard, at the end, there should be a good payday. And then one of two things happens, right? And we talked about this in the episode about buying a practice and the valuations. But then what happens is there's this mental picture of a big pot of gold, and one of two things happens: either reality hits, which is actually the business isn't worth very much, or there's been some maybe out of date or out of touch advisors who maybe present the business as if it's worth way more than it actually is, because they don't understand the industry. And so then this owner has this false sense of value of their work, and definitely their efforts deserved some great rewards. But the reality is they haven't put their attention in the right place. And so what they've created is not valuable. And so either they find out it's not valuable, and then they've got a choice whether to spend a bit of time to make it valuable, or the one that I think is even worse is that a colleague who may not have the right advice comes along, place looks busy, the numbers on paper say, oh, profit of 400, 500,000, which incidentally includes the GP's actual billings, and that's why it's so high. It's not actually profit. And they end up paying 7 figures for a job that they can't escape from. And none of those things are desirable for anyone, I think.
Yeah. I think if people are listening to this and they're reflecting and thinking, what, this might be how I approach things, what should they do? What are the right next steps?
Yeah, so I think the first step is just to take stock. I'd probably listen to this and make some notes again. The reality is that you can't solve a problem you're not willing to accept. We say progress begins with the truth. If you've got that inkling, the first step is to have a conversation. Now, you can book in with us and we'll have a 20-minute conversation with you, unveil some of the opportunity in your practice just to understand it. You can go to one of your professional advisors if they're experienced in the medical space. That's super important. There need to be people who are dealing with the medical space day in, day out. So that's one of the first steps. But actually, there's a step before that, which is making a decision. And that decision is that, yes, I do want to create something better. And yes, I do want to receive a good reward for all the years of effort I've put into ownership. But you can't leave that to chance. It's not, don't leave it to chance. Don't wait till a few months before you want to get out. You need to be thinking about that way in advance. If you're in a partnership, maybe, where this is playing out, this is important to bring up and have a really good discussion about. You may even need to get it facilitated. And again, it's worth paying for second or third opinions on your structure to see if it's right for how you are now and where you want to go for the next part of your journey. Because the way you're structured up until now may be far removed from what's optimal for the next piece of your journey. And so I'd be looking at those things. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think you're right. And through my time at the corporate Sachin, one of the things that I found the worst parts of my job was we would do due diligence on businesses that exactly as you suggested, people that have worked for 20, 30, sometimes more years in a clinic that had enriched themselves greatly, good GPs, and they'd focused on the high retention. And so they paid plenty of tax as well. So had they been more efficiently structured, they may not have given so much across the tax man. However, at the end of it all, I had to break the news to them that business is worth either zero or very close to zero. And they're all variously shocked or surprised. The ones that weren't surprised kind of knew that it wasn't the right approach, but they didn't have the stomach for the restructuring, and not just the physical, elements of getting the experts to change the vehicle that the business is held in, but all of the behaviors that go with that. You're going to need your team to think differently. Your PM is going to go from trying to parent 5, 10, 20 kids towards having a proper board, proper direction, proper strategic plans. It's offering a different personality, because you don't want somebody who's good at politics. You want somebody who's good at leading, managing, and holding other people accountable. So they didn't have the stomach to make the changes required. And I'll be really blunt, they didn't know how to do it, because they'd spent their whole lives doing it one way. They had no insight in the other way. So I think if you're listening to this, the thing to do is just to think, okay, I didn't know there was another way of doing this. And then you just have to walk away and think, what are the different actions I need to take? I think your comment earlier is really important. Go and see somebody who's an expert in accounting, in particular in the space. You should also get some commentary from a legal expert in the space to see, are your structures appropriate for this? And then after that, it's probably about coaching to help with the owner mindset and having the right supportive community around them, as well as the PM, because most likely the PM turns over, has been my experience. The old PM that's used to the politicking doesn't usually make the shift to the new environment. And if they do, great. If they don't, though, then you might need to have a new PM that you need to bring up to speed. That's the type of audience that we work with. But there's a fair bit of work in renovating that business and getting it right. So I think the real message is, if you notice yourself adopting that mindset early on in your career in ownership, then throw a cold glass of water in your face. Do it in an appropriate environment. Don't do it in front of your new MacBook. And then maybe come to your senses and think, actually, there's got to be a better way. Having a shared wealth, which is in the business vehicle, is much more intelligent for the reasons you've already stated. That's our real goal here.
So I might ask you a question, Todd. I'll flip the script. Have you got like a story or an example in mind where you may have seen someone do this well? Like, just it would be great just to hear an example and maybe a timeline that you've seen it done in.
Yeah, I have. And in terms of the number one thing that is important is for the owners, and typically what we've seen with groups we've worked with is a large ownership group. It's usually one or two of the owners that think, this doesn't feel right. I think it needs to be different. There's usually a small sort of breakaway faction that are motivated to change it. And I reckon the two things that are really important are perseverance. They need to not give up at the earliest hurdles, because remember, these are ingrained, and not just ingrained, but they've been rewarded, these behaviors. It's very difficult to break a behavior that is actually being rewarded regularly. So that's the first thing. They got expert advice, so they did know where they needed to move towards. And then it was really just a continuous commitment to education and communication, making sure that people didn't feel threatened in these, in the changeover, and then building towards, you do need deadlines on these. And often they're a really good opportunity to clean up the kind of register of owners, because they'll be varying in their passivity. If you did a spectrum, a green light is they're in and they're committed, and they are not just committed to their personal enrichment, but also the development of the business. Orange, somewhere in between. A red light would be somebody who's just about themselves, is either putting zero effort into the business, or just is not interested in doing it when it's kind of highlighted to them. And that, those people get shaken out. And so at some point in time, there needs to be a conversation about, okay, what are our requirements for somebody to be an owner? Is it just that they sit there and build plenty of patience, or do we expect them to do other things as an owner as well? That goes into some stuff we've covered in other episodes on, the hats of ownership, basically. So that would be another episode to go and have a look at if you're listening here.
Cool. We'll put that in the show notes. And if you're listening and you want to understand the size of the opportunity in your practice, we'll put that link there. It'll be a conversation with us, and we can start to uncover what's there.
Awesome. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you, Sachin. Appreciate your wisdom. Thank you to our listeners. Please like and share this. and subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss any future episodes. Bye.
Bye.